Hi again then guys, and welcome to of course another car review from the world of GT Sport, and this is another day one vehicle, a car that's carried over obviously from the previous game, but we don't have quite as many versions of this car that we used to, not just the GT-R in general, but more specifically racing ones. And the problem with reviewing a GT-R from the point of view of me as a reviewer rather than you as a viewer is there's not much new that you can say. The GT-R is one of those vehicles that it's kind of like the automotive equivalent of doing a review video about water. I can't tell you anything that you don't already know. Water's good for you. You should drink it. Tastes kind of boring though. That's exactly what the GT-R is like, and that's what this video has essentially got to be, because nothing has changed. The game has changed, but the car hasn't. If anything, I would say that the changes to stuff like physics, balance of performance, the Nations Cup integration, FIA, esports, all that kind of stuff, has only aided this R35 race car in particular to be even better than it used to be. Because in GT6, this one used to have kind of a weird bug that would happen, and it wasn't just this one, the Team RJN had the issue as well, where you could tune it to have a very good top speed, up around 260, which is very respectable for a GT car. But the handling became strangely bad. It would lift on the front end, become literally undrivable. It would not turn at all. In fact, it made the Veyron look like a pretty nimble car in comparison. Whereas, to counteract that, you had to sacrifice a massive amount of top-end speed. Now, of course, most of the cars in the game, including stuff like the Tomahawk and the Red Bull, are a lot slower than they used to be. They don't have those kind of advantages, and also most of the cars don't have the kind of power levels that you can tune them to compared to what they could have before, which is slightly offset by the fact that you can actually make them lighter now. That's a pretty cool trade-off to have, because race cars in GT6, for the most part, could not be lightened any further than they already were. And in the case of this one, it's a hefty car. It weighs 1,300 kilos. Now, it doesn't quite fall into GT3 specs, because technically it's not a full-on GT3 car in a traditional sense, it's an N24 car. And for those who are unfamiliar, that's the Nürburgring 24-hour race, which is an interesting form of motorsport which doesn't tend to get the same kind of exposure, as far as conversations go at least, that Le Mans has. For fairly obvious reasons, but still N24 cars and GT24 cars are very intriguing. You've got some really interesting stuff in there. The Vantage N24 car, the hydrogen-powered Aston Martin Rapide. If memory serves, I believe Gumper even ran a hydrogen-powered Apollo at the N24. So there's some cool cars in there, but this one is more traditional. It's almost bridging the gap between N24 and GT3 because it's a little bit lighter than a GT3 equivalent would have been in the previous game. For instance, the Team RJN, the red, white and black YouTube liveried version, that one, if I recall, was 1,350 kilos, like the SLS, like the Z4, but they also had about 590 horsepower. This one weighs 50 kilos less than that, so 1,300, but it's got a lot less power as well, 542. So ironically, it's actually got more like the kind of power that the current production GT-R has, whereas it's easy to forget that this R35, not this specific one, but the R35 in general, is a 12-year-old car. That's kind of crazy to think that the R35 is that old now, 2007. That's insane. And of course we've talked on the channel about overrated vehicles, and the GT-R tends to get thrown into that discussion because a lot of the opposition, the competition, have kind of caught up with it in terms of technological advancement, how good they are, and that's completely true. But it makes the GT-R fall into that category of car that I discussed in my review of the SLR McLaren, and that is cars which were so good, and still are really, but especially when they came out, that it's easy to take them for granted. Stuff like the SLR, the Veyron, the GT-R, these are cars which were so good that as time passes, the natural inclination of a petrol head is to look for the newer, bigger, better thing. So it's easy to take certain cars for granted, especially cars that kind of just get the job done without any fuss. It's easy to remember a big loud Lambo, or a crazy Ferrari, or an exotic Spiker or a Pagani, but something like a GT-R, it just gets the job done relatively quietly, almost in a German kind of way. And that results in the car being undervalued to some degree. Now in the racing world that doesn't tend to happen as much, because as you can clearly see from the Group 2 versions, the newer one in particular, you take a 12-year-old concept of the R35, make some relatively minor updates compared to a lot of other cars, and the kind of facelifts and complete changes that they've had in the span of 12 years, and it can still compete. It's still one of the most dominant things out there, which again goes to show just how far ahead of its time it was. But of course none of this is anything new. So what is new, if anything? Well, I would say that the biggest single thing that makes this car worth reviewing again is not that the car has changed in any particular way, it's that the game has. Because Gran Turismo Sport compared to Gran Turismo 6 makes such a big difference to how useful a car like this can be. Because with physics that are arguably less forgiving, in comparison to the previous games at least, and with cars that are typically not too beginner friendly in Group 3 or Group 2 or even Group 1 categories, to have a car which is as forgiving as a GT-R is a huge advantage for less experienced drivers. But the thing about a GT-R, and this has never changed, is that it's not for beginners and it's not for pros. It's for everyone. The car is that good. There are some cars like the NSX or the RX-7, they are pro inclined. The McLaren F1 is another perfect example. These cars which are kind of twitchy, but once you get to learn how to use them correctly, they are forces to be reckoned with, and more often than not they are very successful. The McLaren F1 was dominant, the Super GT NSXs are the fastest in the game, but they're not the most forgiving thing out there. Then on the other hand you have cars which are really forgiving. You can probably think of some, like hot hatches for instance. Hot hatches or sports cars that do a lot of the work for you. They're really easy to drive, somewhat like a high-powered K car, for instance. But the problem is, cars that are very beginner-friendly tend to have limits which you reach very quickly. So the classic Mini, for instance, it's super easy to drive, but you're never going to beat a supercar with it. Or at least not driven by a human. You could probably beat the AI. But you know what I mean. You reach the car's limits very quickly because it's good due to not having a huge amount of power. So of course it's going to have good handling. Whereas a GT-R strikes a fantastic balance between both. It's beginner friendly, which is remarkable given its performance, but at the same time it's not a car which a beginner can ever find the limits of. You do need to be a pro to still get the best out of a GT-R, but it's such a respectable piece of engineering, and that's why I actually have a huge amount of respect for the GT-R, the R35 in particular. Because although I don't love the car, certainly not, I'd never buy one, but I love what is behind it. I love the tech put into it, the engineering, the thought, in a similar way to how I respect the McLaren F1, but I don't love that either. To me, these cars are very special, and it's not something that you should take for granted. It's very easy to, especially with new debuts like the Lamborghini Huracan and stuff like that, but don't sleep on the GT-R. It's a reliable workhorse of a race car, and it's a legend for a reason. Is it OP? Is it too forgiving? Yeah, probably. But there's a reason for that. It's really good. And balance of performance, for instance, can change everything, but the GT-R is so good at its core that fundamentally it pretty much always stays a good car. So if you're looking for a somewhat boring but very reliable option in terms of all-round ability, power, handling, etc., of course the GT-R is a great one to go for. So if you're looking for just that, then check out the car. It's not the most exciting option around anymore, but it's still a good one, for a reason. And that's it, of course, overall for this review. I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.